One of the things that I should have said earlier is that this book goes from the very beginning of discovery, all the pre-Mayflower stuff, the history that we don't get in schools and never seems to be taught. And I'm curious about your opinion. Why not teach history through sort of books like this? I remember the history books when I was a kid, 2-3 years ago, you know, in high school, at college, and I remember that they were A, rather boring, B, and I'll get in trouble for this, always taught by the football coach, and C, we always started with the Mayflower, and then we almost got to World War II. That was my experience, like over and over and over. That was history. That was American history. What do you think if somebody were to pick up your text and say, we're going to teach this quarter, and this is going to be history?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you know, I wish we did, not necessarily my book, but teach, you know, what's in it, these events, because, you know, nothing dismays me more than when people say, you know, I hate history, it's homework. And I think we can be a little too pious about our history, partly because we always begin it with those dreary pilgrims. And in fact, you know, if kids could be turned on to conquistadors and marauding Vikings and Pocahontas and all these great, the true Pocahontas, all these wonderful stories that precede the Mayflower story, I think kids might be more excited about history right from the go.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm curious about that, the true Pocahontas. Now that you've written this book, what do you think the odds are of finding truth in history, or finding and moving through the myths that we're so ready to believe? Mm-hmm. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, you know, I think we have to be humble about how close we can get to the truth about any of these stories, you know, hundreds of years ago, where the sources can be quite sketchy or unreliable. So, you know, you do the best you can. No, I think we're very invested in these myths. You know, we need a creation story, a story of origins. And for instance, the Plymouth story gives us a kind of specific point of origin, Plymouth. It gives us a sacred rock, gives us a sacred ceremony with Thanksgiving. It's kind of a nice package there. So to tell people, well, you know, that's not really the story. It's much messier. There are many more characters, and it's not a very pretty story a lot of the time. Well, it's hard to make a sort of national story of origin out of that. So I'm not confident that we're going to sort of toss over the Pilgrims in favor of, you know, the Spanish and the French and all the others who were wandering around here long before the Pilgrims got here.
Now you've got a great cover illustration, cartoons showing different places on your journey where you had stopped. I'm curious about that. Oftentimes writers don't have a lot of control over their cover illustrations, but I thought that this one was particularly striking because it seemed to me to be an attempt to convey the tone of the book, the sometimes humorous, but also I was wondering if it was a way to appeal to maybe a slightly younger demographic with this book. What was the take on that?
You know, I wish I could take some credit for that. You know, you have some input. That was really the publisher's decision. The hardback had a picture from the archives that I had found that they sort of adapted in bright colors, again, to convey that this is history, but history with a twist. And I guess they just went a little further with the paperback cover with, as you say, these kind of cartoonish figures. Mm-hmm. I think it's more some marketing decision on there, you know, position it more as travel and less as history. But I can't say I had a lot of input in that.
Now, a person who was reading the book, works with me, wanted me to ask you this question. In your author photo, there's a very good-looking dog, but the dog makes no appearance in the thing, and it prompted us to ask, you know, how many weeks on the road does it take to produce a travelogue like this, where you're traveling alone without even the company of the handsome dog? How long did it take?
It's a little hard to time exactly because the book overall was about 4 years, and I would tend to do some research, hit the road, come back, do more research. So all told, there was probably a year of traveling spread over a couple of years of time. So if I had to guess, I'd say about a year on the road.
And you've got a knack, it seems, for walking into places and finding people to talk to you. Is this something that's always been part of your character? Is this a journalistic trait that you've picked up? How do you walk into a bar like the one you describe that's surprisingly full of a bunch of Norse sort of people in the middle of, I think it's
Kansas.
Yeah, Kansas. And how does this? What's the trick there?
Trick is you walk in, order a drink, and start talking to people. I think that does reflect having spent 15 years as a journalist, a lot of it overseas, helpless and lost. And I think you just get over any shame about just going up to strangers and saying, help me, lost tourist here, talk to me, or just chatting. And what's the worst that can happen? They walk away, they slam a door in your face, and that rarely happens, particularly in America. People love to talk. So I've just found over the years, it's easier than it looks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was thinking about that. You describe a journey that you take with someone you meet in, I think it's Colombia, Dominican Republic, and the journey seems terrifying to me. You're relying on someone you've never met to go into what seems like sort of a dangerous area in a place where you don't speak the language. My hat is off to you. I could never do this, but I was fascinated by the ability to do it.
Again, I think it's just become second nature for me. I don't think it was that dangerous. He was a terrible driver. Probably the most dangerous thing I did on that trip was eat chicharrones, which is a sort of Dominican delicacy that's sort of a pig skin with fat and gristle hanging off, sort of fried with car fumes, etc. Dominicans love it, and it's famously fatal to foreigners.
Right, I remember him saying you have 4 hours to live.
Yeah, when he found out I'd eaten it, he said, whatever, we better move quickly because you only have a few hours left to live. I survived.
I was to say, you don't mention anything from that point on. There's no discussion of any repercussion.
Well, there were some, but I'm not sure the reader needs to know all the details of one's travels.
Right, okay. Well, it also made me wonder, was it the only thing to eat in that area? You just made that decision that you were going to take that risk?
Yeah, as I describe in the book, we hadn't eaten all day, and there was no electricity in this town. It was at night, and it was just a guy on the street sort of carving some meat that I couldn't identify. It looked kind of like burnt ear. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And it tasted good in a kind of disgusting sort of way, maybe a little like crackling or something. And so I had several portions of it. And not until the next day did I find out, that I had taken my life in my hands.
Right, yeah. Well, I think anytime you have the opportunity to eat burnt ear, you should take it.
Should never be missed. I also had cod tongues in Newfoundland. Who knew cod had
tongues? I remember thinking that same thing. I didn't know that. It never occurred to me that fish had tongues.
Yeah.
Are they the only fish that has a tongue?
I really couldn't tell you that, but I can tell you that when it comes on your plate, it's sort of fried in a sort of dough that you could be eating anything. So it was like fried clams.
Okay. Now, with all the sources that you went, you've said that they're sort of they can be unreliable or ambiguous. How do you gauge the accuracy of a source? Are you always trying to find? Often journalists will always try to have two sources for the same sort of fact, or three. How do you do this with something like the Norse sagas, or do you just make a decision that I'm going to take what they say with a slight grain of salt and just relay it and see what happens?
Right. In an instance like the Norse sagas, that's really the only written source we have from that era. However, there's, for instance, archaeological evidence that confirms part of the sagas. They say they went to here, and well, what do you know? Archaeologists found the remains of a Norse settlement. So I think you do, in a sense, what you do as a journalist, you try and get the most reliable information you can, and you try and be open with the reader about what we really can know and what is kind of hazy. And I think you, over time, reading a lot of these accounts from this era, you begin to be able to tell who are reliable narrators and who's just making stuff up out of whole cloth.
It's funny because the conquistadors' records struck me particularly as people who weren't aware of PR. Because they record many of the horrible things that they did.
Exactly. I mean, for instance, court documents, I think, any historian would say, are one of the treasures, because they tend to be, people are under oath, or it's a fact-finding commission. Doesn't mean you're getting at the absolute truth. And yes, the Spanish are constantly prosecuting themselves. These conquistadors come back, and you get in great detail the atrocities committed against native people.